The clock struck midnight as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. A single email had arrived moments ago, an unsigned message with just 3 words. It's time to know. Her heart raced, though her face betrayed no emotion. For years, she'd suspected something was wrong, but never dared to confront it. Now, the truth seemed closer than ever. She clicked open the attachment, revealing a series of cryptic photos and documents. Each image told a story of betrayal, manipulation, and secrets buried deep within her family's past. The first photo showed 2 figures standing side by side, their faces blurred but unmistakably familiar. One was her mother, the other, someone who should have been long gone from their lives. But how? And why? As she scrolled further, one name stood out repeatedly: Tommy. His actions over the years suddenly made sense. His laziness, his indifference, his constant demands. It wasn't just entitlement. It was part of a larger plan orchestrated by someone else entirely. Someone who claimed to love them all equally, but clearly favored only one. Her mind flashed back to childhood memories, laughter-filled mornings interrupted by tragedy, new beginnings tainted by resentment, and promises broken before they could even take root. She remembered the day everything changed, the moment when her role shifted from daughter to outsider, replaced by a brother who became the center of everyone's universe. Now, armed with this newfound knowledge, she faced an impossible choice. Should she expose the web of lies that bound her family together, or walk away forever, leaving behind the toxic ties that had haunted her for decades? As dawn broke outside her window, she whispered a single vow under her breath: no more. Thimiko, weight of those 2 words hung heavy in the air, a promise to herself that would set into motion events she could never undo. The days following her father's death were a blur of grief and confusion. She remembered the way her mother had clung to her in those early weeks, tears streaming down her face as they both tried to make sense of the unimaginable loss. But life, relentless and unforgiving, had pushed them forward, whether they were ready or not. Her mother returned to teaching after a few months, though she seemed distant, as if part of her soul had been buried alongside her husband. The house grew quieter, the laughter that once filled its walls now replaced by an oppressive silence. It was during one of these somber evenings, at a community support group for widowed parents, that her mother met Richard. He was tall, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded her faintly of her father. At first, she resented his presence, his attempts to fill a void she didn't want filled. But over time, she began to see how much he cared for her mother, and when they married within a year, she told herself it might be okay. Maybe this new chapter could bring some light back into their lives. But then came the bombshell. Her mother was pregnant. She remembered the day vividly. Her mother sat her down on the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on her growing belly. "Lily," she said softly, "you're going to be a big sister." For a moment, she felt excitement bubbling inside her. A sibling, someone to share secrets with, to play games with, to build memories alongside. But that excitement quickly soured as reality set in. Within months of Tommy's birth, her mother quit her job as an elementary school teacher, claiming that staying home was crucial for his development. "I need to focus on him," her mother would say whenever anyone questioned her decision. "These early years are so important." But what about her early years? What about the countless mornings she'd woken up alone because her mother was too busy caring for a newborn? What about the lunches forgotten, the homework ignored, the milestones overlooked? She wanted to ask these questions, to demand answers, but the words always stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched silently as her mother's world shrank until it revolved entirely around Tommy. Her stepfather, Richard, noticed. She saw the worried frowns he wore whenever her mother dismissed her needs in favor of Tommy's. One evening, as she sat alone doing her homework at the dining table, he pulled up a chair beside her. "You know, Lily," he said quietly, helping her solve a particularly tricky math problem. Sometimes people get so caught up in one thing that they forget to see what else they might be missing. His words lingered in her mind long after the lesson ended. They weren't just about math. They were about her life, her place in this family that no longer seemed to include her. As Tommy grew older, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Richard tried talking to her mother countless times about her obsession with Tommy, but each conversation ended the same way, with her mother growing defensive and angry. One particular evening stood out in her memory. Dinner was tense, the air thick with unspoken grievances. Tommy, barely 5 years old, pushed his food around his plate while her mother hovered over him, coaxing him to eat just one more bite. "Sarah," Richard said finally, setting down his fork, "we need to talk about this. You can't keep hovering over him like this. He needs to learn to do things on his own." Her mother's face hardened instantly. "Are you saying I'm a bad mother?" "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Richard replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You've got 2 kids here, not 1. And a husband too, by the way." She pretended to focus intently on her mashed potatoes, but she was hanging on to every word. "He needs me," her mother snapped, glaring at Richard. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I was young too," under her breath, though nobody seemed to hear her. The breaking point came when Richard suggested enrolling Tommy in Little League Baseball. She was sitting on the stairs, supposedly working on her homework, when she heard their voices rising from the kitchen below. "Absolutely not!" Her mother's voice was shrill. "Do you know how dangerous baseball can be? He could get hit by the ball or twist his ankle." "For God's sake, Sarah, you can't protect him from everything," Richard shot back. But her mother wouldn't budge. Instead, she enrolled Tommy in art classes at the community centre, a decision that lasted all of 3 sessions before Tommy quit, claiming boredom. Her mother blamed the teacher, insisting that they simply hadn't understood her son's creative spirit. Meanwhile, Richard started spending more time with her. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was his way of balancing out her mother's neglect. But he took her to karate classes 3 times a week, cheering louder than any other parent. When she earned her belts, under his attention she flourished. She learned discipline, resilience, and the importance of standing up for herself. Lessons that would prove invaluable in the years to come. Yet even as she thrived, Tommy spiraled further into chaos. His room became a disaster zone, toys and clothes strewn everywhere, and her mother turned to her with that familiar look. "Lily, dear, clean up Tommy's room," she'd say, not asking, but telling. When Richard caught wind of this arrangement, he confronted her mother. "She's not his maid, Sarah," he protested. "He needs to learn to clean up after himself." That's when her mother burst into tears, pulling out her ultimate weapon. "I knew it. You love her more than your own son. How can you treat Tommy this way?" She watched Richard's face fall, saw the fight leave his eyes. He gave her an apologetic glance before raising his hands in surrender. "Fine. Have it your way." And with that, he walked away. After that, Richard stopped arguing with her mother about Tommy, but the look he gave her said everything. He hadn't given up on her, even if he'd given up on fighting her mother. It was a small comfort, but sometimes small comforts are all we have. College became her sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe without the weight of her mother's favoritism and Tommy's growing indifference pressing down on her. For the first time in years, she felt like more than just an afterthought. At Marshall University, nestled in the quiet hills of West Virginia, she discovered a world that didn't revolve around Tommy or her mother's endless excuses for him. Richard had made sure she was prepared. Before she left for school, he handed her a folder filled with college brochures and financial plans. "Sky's the limit, Lily," he said, his voice steady but warm. But when her mother walked into the room mid-conversation, everything changed. "You can't be serious," her mother exclaimed, her tone sharp. That money should be saved for Tommy's future. He's going to need it more. The argument escalated quickly, as it always did when Richard tried to advocate for her. This time, though, Richard didn't back down. His face hardened, a look she'd seen too many times during these confrontations. This is non-negotiable, Sarah. I've already made my decision. She chose Marshall University, not too far to visit occasionally, but far enough to start fresh. On moving day, Richard helped her unpack boxes while her mother stayed home. Because Tommy couldn't handle being away from her, the irony wasn't lost on her. As they stood in her tiny dorm room, Richard gave her one last piece of advice. Don't let anyone make you feel small, Lily. You're capable of greatness. And she was. College life suited her perfectly. She joined clubs, excelled in her classes, and even started tutoring other students. Every weekend, she called home. Well, mostly Richard. Her mother was always too busy with Tommy, who was apparently going through yet another difficult phase. During one call, Richard explained, he's hanging out with kids from the wrong side of the tracks. I tried getting him involved in some after-school programs, but your mother, he sighed heavily. Let me guess, she interrupted. She said you were being too hard on him. Exactly, Richard replied. Called me a tyrant for suggesting he might need some structure. Her visits home became less frequent as Tommy's behavior worsened. When she did come back, he barely acknowledged her existence, holed up in his room with video games. The few times she caught glimpses of him, he looked pale and angry, his eyes glued to various screens. Meanwhile, she was thriving, earning accolades at school, building friendships, and planning for her future. After graduation, she landed a job at a consulting firm in West Virginia. It was everything she'd worked for: independence, stability, and purpose. But as she climbed the ladder of success, Tommy descended further into his self-imposed isolation. During one rare visit home, she knocked on his door. Tommy, want to grab lunch? My treat. All she got in response was the sound of gunfire from whatever game he was playing. Her mother passed by in the hallway and shrugged. He's not feeling social today. He's very stressed, you know. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been starker. While she pursued her career goals, Tommy pursued virtual achievements, supported endlessly by their mother's excuses. Richard's disappointed face said it all, but by then, even he had largely given up on trying to intervene. By the age of 27, she had finally saved enough for a down payment on her own place, a modest one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. It wasn't huge, but it was hers. The day she got the keys, she couldn't stop smiling. All those years of saving, brown bag lunches, and saying no to designer clothes had paid off. You all have to come see it, she announced during her weekly call home. I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner. Richard, I'm even making your favorite lasagna. I wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo, Richard replied warmly. Her mother's voice cut in on the other line. Oh, honey, I don't think we can make it. Tommy has plans that day. Plans? She asked skeptically. In the background, she could hear the familiar sounds of Tommy's video game blasting away. When the day of the housewarming arrived, only Richard showed up. He brought a potted plant and a bottle of wine. Your mother sends her love, he said, but they both knew that was a lie. Over dinner, Richard filled her in on what was really happening at home. Tommy, now 20, hadn't bothered with college and spent his days either gaming or hanging out with his drinking buddies. Richard had tried to help, offering him a position at his construction company. Just as a starting point, you know, Richard explained, twirling pasta on his fork. Everyone needs to start somewhere. But her mother shot the idea down immediately. Sarah said it would be beneath him. Can you believe that? Said Tommy was too intelligent for manual labor. Too intelligent to work, but not too intelligent to mooch off his parents, she muttered under her breath. Richard gave her a sad smile. I keep trying, Lily. God knows I keep trying. That was the last real conversation they had. 2 years later, she received the call that changed everything. Richard had collapsed at work. A massive heart attack, just like her father. By the time she reached the hospital, he was gone. The funeral was surreal. Her mother put on quite a show, sobbing dramatically and telling anyone who would listen what a wonderful husband Richard had been. "We were so happy," she wailed. "How will we manage without him?" Standing there at Richard's grave, she couldn't help but think about how history had repeated itself. Another father figure, another heart attack, another funeral. Only this time, she was old enough to see everything clearly, including the fact that her mother's tears were more about her bank account than her broken heart. A year after Richard's death, she had mostly lost touch with her mother and Tommy. What little she knew came from Aunt Linda's occasional calls. "They're getting by on Richard's savings," Aunt Linda told her. "Your mum sold his Chevrolet last month. The tools from his workshop went before that." She tried not to care, she really did. But when her mother's number flashed on her phone one Tuesday evening, her heart still skipped a beat. "Lily." Her mother's voice sounded smaller than she remembered. "I need you to come home. Please." Something in her tone made her book a flight for the next day. When she pulled up to their old house, she barely recognized the place. The once pristine lawn Richard had meticulously maintained was overgrown with weeds. Paint peeled from the window frames, and one of the shutters hung crooked. But the house wasn't the only thing that had aged poorly. Her mother opened the door, and she had to suppress a gasp. The vibrant woman she remembered had been replaced by someone who looked 20 years older than her actual age. Deep wrinkles lined her face, and her hair, which she'd always kept perfectly coloured and styled, showed stark grey roots. "Come in," her mother said, leading her into the living room. The house smelled musty, and dishes were piled in the sink. A thin layer of dust covered everything. This from the woman who used to make her rewash plates if she spotted a single water spot. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, settling onto the couch. A spring dug into her thigh, another thing Richard would have fixed immediately. Her mother broke down almost immediately. "We're running out of money, Lily. My pension barely covers the utilities and the savings." She twisted her hands in her lap. "They're almost gone." "What about Tommy? Is he helping with expenses?" Her mother's face did this complicated dance between embarrassment and defensiveness. "He's looking for work. It's not his fault. These employers, they just don't understand him. The last place wanted him to start at 8 p.m. No, Tommy's not a morning person. And the one before that expected him to do manual labour. With his intelligence." She felt her jaw tightening. "Mom, at his age and with no experience, he can't exactly be picky about—" "You don't understand!" Her mother cut her off, her voice rising to that familiar pitch that always preceded a Tommy defence. Then abruptly her tone changed. "Lily, we need your help. We won't survive without it. I hate to ask, but you're doing so well in your career." She knew what was coming. Part of her wanted to refuse, to remind her mother of all the times she chose Tommy over her. But looking at her worn face, the trembling hands, the desperate eyes, she couldn't. "How much do you need?" When her mother said $1,500 per month, she nearly choked. That was a significant chunk of her salary. But she found herself nodding anyway. "Where's Tommy now?" "Oh, he's at a job interview." Her mother brightened slightly. Through the window, she could see Tommy's bedroom light on and the familiar flicker of his computer screen. Some things never changed. True to her word, she set up an automatic transfer of $1,500 to her mother's account every month. Each time she saw that deduction from her bank balance, she told herself it was the right thing to do, even if it meant postponing her own plans for a bigger apartment or a new car. The months following her decision to cut off financial support were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, relief, guilt, and ultimately, liberation. She had expected some form of retaliation from her mother, Tommy, or even Candy, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer volume of attempts they made to manipulate her back into their lives. Her social media accounts became battlegrounds. Every post she shared was met with passive-aggressive comments from her mother, accusing her of being selfish and heartless. Tommy chimed in too, posting cryptic statuses about ungrateful siblings who abandon family when times get tough. Candy, ever the drama queen, uploaded photos of herself looking sad and neglected, captioned with vague complaints about how hard life had become without Lily's help. But the worst part wasn't the public shaming, it was the private messages. Dozens of them flooded her inbox daily, each one more desperate than the last. Her mother begged, pleaded, and threatened, alternating between sob stories about unpaid bills and outright accusations that Lily was trying to ruin their lives. One particularly venomous message stood out. "You think you're so smart, cutting us off like this? You'll regret it when we're gone. Nobody will care about you then." She deleted the message without responding. For years, she'd allowed her mother's words to dictate her actions, always striving to prove herself worthy of love that never came. But now, something inside her had shifted. The weight of her family's expectations no longer felt like hers to carry. Instead, she focused on building a future that belonged solely to her, a future free from their toxicity. During this time, she also began revisiting old memories of Richard. His voice echoed in her mind during moments of doubt, reminding her of the lessons he taught her: resilience, self-worth, and the importance of standing up for herself. She often found herself smiling at the thought of him cheering her on as she earned yet another promotion at work or saved another chunk of money toward her dream home. One evening, while scrolling through real estate listings online, she stumbled upon a property that took her breath away. It was a cozy 3-bedroom house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, complete with a backyard big enough for gardening, a hobby she'd always wanted to try. The price tag was steep, but within reach if she continued saving diligently. As she stared at the photos of the sunlit kitchen and charming front porch, she realized something profound. This house represented more than just shelter. It symbolized independence, growth, and a fresh start. Meanwhile, her mother, Tommy, and Candy seemed to be spiraling further into chaos. Aunt Linda called occasionally, updating her on their increasingly dire situation. "They've stopped paying utilities," Aunt Linda confided during one such call. "Your mum says they can't afford groceries anymore. Tommy spends most of his days sulking, and Candy's talking about moving back to her hometown." "Good," she replied coldly. "Maybe reality will finally sink in." Aunt Linda sighed. "I know you've been hurt, Lily, and I understand why you did what you did. But don't let bitterness consume you. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting them back into your life. It means freeing yourself from the hold they have over you." Her words lingered long after the call ended. Forgiveness. Could she really forgive her mother for decades of neglect? For choosing Tommy over her time and again? For signing away the family home without consulting her? The idea felt impossible, yet strangely appealing, not for their sake but for hers. As winter turned to spring, she threw herself into planning for her new life. The house she'd fallen in love with remained her primary goal, but she also started exploring other ways to invest in her future. A co-worker recommended a financial advisor who helped her set up a diversified portfolio that included stocks, bonds, and retirement funds. For the first time, she felt truly in control of her destiny. Work became her sanctuary. Her boss noticed her renewed focus and rewarded her efforts with a significant raise. With her newfound income, she treated herself to small luxuries she'd denied herself for years: a weekend getaway to the mountains, a designer handbag she'd admired for ages, and cooking classes where she learned to perfect Richard's famous lasagna recipe. Each indulgence felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost for far too long. Yet, despite her progress, the past still lingered in unexpected ways. One afternoon, while shopping for furniture for her future home, she ran into an old acquaintance from high school. They exchanged pleasantries before the conversation inevitably turned to family. "How's your mum doing?" the woman asked casually. "And your brother? Haven't seen them around much lately." "They're managing," she replied evasively, forcing a polite smile. "Things change, you know." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, families can be complicated. My sister and I don't talk anymore. Sometimes it's better that way." Her words struck a chord. Better. Was it really better to sever ties completely? Or was there still room for reconciliation, not with her mother or Tommy, but with the version of herself that had spent so many years seeking their approval? That night, she sat down with a pen and paper. writing out everything she needed to release: the resentment, the guilt, the longing for a relationship that could never be. When she finished, she tore the pages into tiny pieces and scattered them into the wind, watching as they disappeared into the night sky. It was symbolic, yes, but also deeply cathartic. Around the same time, she received an unexpected letter from Aunt Linda. Enclosed was a copy of Richard's will, which left her a modest inheritance. "He always believed in you," Aunt Linda wrote in the accompanying note. "Use this however you see fit. You deserve it." Tears streamed down her face as she read the words. Richard's faith in her had been unwavering, even when her own belief in herself wavered. Determined to honor his memory, she used the money to make an offer on the house. Within weeks, the deal was finalized. On moving day, she stood in the doorway of her new home, taking in the sight of boxes stacked neatly against freshly painted walls. This was it, the culmination of years of sacrifice, perseverance, and courage. As she unpacked her belongings, she paused to hang a framed photo of Richard on the mantelpiece. Beneath it, she placed a single red rose, whispering softly, "Thank you." Months passed, and her new life settled into a rhythm of peace and fulfillment. The garden she'd dreamed of planting flourished under her care, filling the air with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Weekends were spent hosting dinner parties for friends, experimenting with recipes she'd learned in cooking class, and savoring the simple joys of solitude. Occasionally, thoughts of her mother, Tommy, and Candy crept into her mind, but they no longer carried the same sting. She imagined them struggling to adapt to their new reality. Tommy forced to take odd jobs, Candy growing restless, and her mother finally confronting the consequences of her choices. While she didn't wish them harm, she also recognized that their problems were no longer hers to solve. One crisp autumn morning, she drove past her childhood home. The once overgrown lawn was mowed, and the peeling paint had been touched up. A for sale sign stood proudly in the yard. She slowed the car, curiosity getting the better of her, and pulled over. A real estate agent greeted her warmly, eager to show her around. Inside, the house looked different, cleaner, brighter, emptier. The familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath her feet brought back a flood of memories, both painful and precious. As she wandered through the rooms, she felt a strange sense of closure washing over her. In the kitchen, she paused, running her fingers along the counter where her father used to flip pancakes. For a moment, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for him, but for the life she might have had if circumstances had been different. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped outside, leaving the past behind for good. Back at her own home, she sat down with a cup of tea and opened a blank journal. On the first page, she wrote, "To anyone reading this, life is full of betrayals, disappointments, and injustices. But it's also full of opportunities to grow, to heal, and to create something beautiful out of broken pieces. Don't wait for someone else to give you permission to live your best life. Take it. Own it. You deserve it." Closing the journal, she smiled. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came her way.